Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Barnelli Chaudhary, and I'm the director of the Nathanson Center, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this OR Emmett event. Before we get started, I will pass the floor over to our dean, Trevor Farrell, who will do the land acknowledgement and introduce our eminent speaker. Trevor?
Thanks very much, Professor Chaudhary. Can people hear me? At least I can ask that question in the room, and welcome to those online. My name is Trevor Farrell, the dean here. Delighted to see everyone. I will welcome and introduce our speaker, Professor Koh, in a moment. I do want to say a few words of welcome. Before I do, I'm going to acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. We recognize that the area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We further acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to share and care for the Great Lakes region. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here opening the OR Emmett lecture. I want to start by thanking the Jack and May Nathanson Center for organizing and hosting the event, and to our colleagues at the Nathanson Center for putting this on, and Professor Chaudhary for your leadership, of course, as well. And Liel, I thought I saw you in the room somewhere, but nothing happens also without her, so I'm delighted for that, and our colleagues at York. The OR Emmett Lecture, today's session, is presented annually here at Osgoode by the Nathanson Center, and is obviously supported by the OR Emmett Fund. The OR Emmett Fund was established in 1976 to promote the study, broadly as defined, in areas of public discussion, public discourse, issues of the day, scholarly writing in public and professional appreciation of the significance of those issues, including ethics, religion, culture, and the historical development of the legal system. So it's obviously a broadly encompassing lecture series, and the phrase OR Emmett means, as I understand it, the light of truth in Hebrew. I'm absolutely honored and delighted to introduce our speaker today, Professor Harold Koh, the Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale Law School. Now, I did my PhD in politics, actually, and one of my fields was international relations. So I feel like I've known Professor Koh for a long time, even though he has no idea who I am. And when I needed to familiarize myself with his bio, I actually thought I was reading the bios of the entire faculty at Yale Law School until I realized it was just one guy. Having worked for 4 US presidents, advised at the State Department, as a clerk at the Supreme Court of the United States, having written numerous books, I think at most recent 9, amongst all other stuff, a recent Yale publication in just last year, even this year. Having honorary doctorates at numerous universities, having lectured around the world, Professor Koh is the real deal. There aren't many intellectuals and legal academics in the world right now who have achieved the kind of impact, both from a scholarly heft, the reach, and also what I also think is really impressive is the actual practical application and impact, including two current cases, or recent cases, one involving Canada, one involving the Ukraine, at international tribunals. I could go on, but we actually want to get to the most interesting part, which is Professor Koh. But I don't want to understate the importance of his work, the reach of his work, and just so delighted. I know that you've actually taught some of our students in the past, and so you're not unfamiliar to Osgoode, but we're delighted to finally welcome you to the building. So without further ado, Professor Koh, thanks for spending your time today, and look forward to your session.
Well, it's a complete honor and thrill to be here. My affiliation with Osgood Hall Law School began 35 years ago when I was asked to teach a winter course on international business transactions downtown. And there were about 70 students, but about half of them turned out to be from Osgood Hall. And they were the fun ones. And at the end of the 2-week course, one of the Osgood students came and said, "We understand you're a baseball fan. Have you seen the Rogers Center?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, we're going to do a pub crawl and end up at the Rogers Center." Anyway, after the pub crawl, I didn't remember much about the Rogers Center. And then they presented me with an Osgood Hall t-shirt, which I then wore day and night for the next 3 years until it ripped, and then my wife made me throw it away. But Barnelli today gave me a Osgood Hall hoodie, which I intend to wear also day and night in the future. So it's been a great joy. My friend Craig Scott, I met many years ago, my dear student and colleague Patricia McMahon. And so it's been a wonderful relationship. But this is actually the first time I've been to the Kiel campus, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm particularly pleased that I'm here in a presidential election year for the United States. The Nathanson Center asked you to talk about issues relating to transnational human rights, crime, and security. And tomorrow downtown, there is a session on the future of transnational torts, which I'm going to be enjoying speaking at. But today I wanted to talk about a different aspect of this, an overlooked constitutional crisis in the United States. Will America's president be a national security threat? Let me just start with 3 yes or no questions, and I'm actually going to ask you to raise your hand. Number 1, does the US Constitution exempt foreign affairs from the principle of checks and balances? If you think the answer is no, please raise your hand. Second, if Donald Trump is elected president on day 1, January 21st, 2025, could he immediately after taking office tweet, "I withdraw the United States from all international agreements and all international institutions," which number in the thousands? If you think no, please raise your hand. And then third, if Kamala Harris is elected president, could she, without congressional input, unilaterally take us into World War III in the Mideast against a series of enemies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, Lebanon, the Houthis? I'm not saying that she would want to, but is there anything legally that would prevent her from doing so? Again, if you think the answer is no, she couldn't do it, please raise your hand. Well, the actual answer to each of these questions is that legally you would think the answer is no, but in fact, we don't know. And that's the problem. That's the problem. And as the dean was kind enough to mention, this is a problem I've studied for 5 decades under 4 presidents. It began in the 80s. I graduated from law school. I clerked for 2 years and then went to work for the Reagan Justice Department, and then ended up at Yale Law School teaching a course called Foreign Relations Law. During that time, something happened called the Iran-Contra affair, and I wrote a law review article about it for the Yale Law Journal. And Yale University Press asked me to write a book, which I did, to come up for tenure. And during that period, because if I didn't write the book, I wouldn't get tenure, every night I would get into bed and say to my wife, "If I get hit by a truck, get the book out." After that, and this often happens to you if you've written a lot of books or any books, you turn it in and you say, I wish I wrote the book differently. And I thought, maybe I should have just started at the beginning of the Republic and gone to the present. And maybe sometime before I'm done, I will redo it. But life has a way of intervening. So in the 90s, I sued the US government in a number of cases. Then I became head in the Clinton administration of the State Department's Human Rights Bureau. Then I became dean of the law school, so an executive myself. In the 2010s, I was legal advisor of the State Department, wrote another book about the Trump administration. And as the dean mentioned, at the start of the Biden administration, I went back in as a senior political appointee in the same office I had been the legal advisor. At the same time, I continued to do a number of cases at the international tribunals. I'm the lawyer for Ukraine in 4 cases. One of them were also representing Canada about the shoot down of the Ukrainian airliner over Tehran in 2020. And in fall of 2021, I ended up back in Oxford as a visiting professor. And I had actually told them I would write a book on another subject. And I was sitting there, my wife visited and she went home, and I thought, maybe now's the time to redo that book. When am I ever going to get another chance? But I was embarrassed to admit that I had said I would write a different book. And so I actually worked on the book for about 2 months without telling anybody, including my own wife. And there were ups and downs, experience, and then it started to come together. And then I came back to the States because Russia, as you recall, invaded Ukraine. We filed another case at the International Court of Justice. And when I got back, my publisher told me, if you're going to get the book out before the election, you have to get it in by a certain date. So for the last 6 months, every night I would get in bed and say to my wife, if I get hit by a truck, get the book out. Anyway, it's out. And so you heard the personal story. There's a historical story here too, which is how the United States got to its current situation, which is, I believe, that the president has become a national security threat. And I'll say more about this in a moment. And third, there's an ethical story. How did lawyers create the problem and what can they do to fix it? So the basic thesis of the book, the original book, is that within the US Constitution, there's a subset of rules that I like to call the National Security Constitution. It's a very few provisions of the constitutional text. There are a very small number of Supreme Court cases. There's some framework statutes and executive orders. But the basic idea is that checks and balances don't stop at the water's edge, that the national security power is a power shared. Now, this is not just the constitutional vision, it's a policy vision that better promotes democratic outcomes and reduces the risks of catastrophic outcomes. And the spirit is balanced institutional participation, as set forth in Justice Jackson's famous concurring opinion in the steel seizure case, Youngstown. The president's powers are not fixed, but they fluctuate depending on their conjunction with Congress, and they're reviewable by the courts. But over US history, starting at the founding, the Federalist Papers and others, and as best articulated in an opinion in 1936 by Justice George Sutherland called US versus Curtis Wright Export, is against this notion of balanced power, is that the president has all the power. The words are, the president is the sole organ of the nation in its foreign affairs. That's a quote. When I was in the Justice Department, this was known as the Curtis Wright, so I'm right site. So I tell this story in the first 9 chapters, running through American history. I now call this the Eras Tour. That was then appropriated by someone else for some relatively less well-known thing than my book. But running from America's infancy to its rise to be a dominant regional power, to world hegemon, to the Iran-Contra affair, which is where the last book ended, and now to the post-Cold War years, the age of terror after 9/11, and then the period now of new global threats. So the book runs to today. It's Israel-Hamas war, but starting in 1980, it becomes increasingly autobiographical because I was involved with every single issue that arises in some way or another. But since the 21st century, 24 years ago, September 11th, we now see that there are even greater institutional incentives for the 3 branches to interact in a dysfunctional way. The president, whether weak or strong, has a very strong incentive to monopolize the foreign policy response. Congress increasingly has incentives to acquiesce, and the courts tend to whitewash the president's actions and rubber stamp and defer. So the president's acting, Congress is accepting, and the courts are either refusing to review or rubber stamping what the president does, which leads to a systematic flow toward executive power. And here's where the ethical story comes in. Lawyers, including myself at various points in my life, address these issues case by case. And what they do is they perceive a national security threat, and they perceive that the best solution to that threat is for the president to act. And so their goal in writing legal opinions for the executive branch is to free the president of constraints so that he has maximum freedom to respond. And no one puts together the global picture, the collective picture of all of these executive opinions, which is you give the power to the president to be almost free of constraint, which frees the president to become the greatest national security threat of all. Now, I really want to emphasize, this problem is structural. It is structural. There's a tendency in every country, but particularly in the United States, to say, well, if Kamala Harris is elected president, this problem will be solved. It will not be solved. It may be muted. If Donald Trump is reelected president, it will certainly be exacerbated. But the problem is that the institutional presidency, Congress, and the courts all have institutional incentives to behave this way, and we never address that problem. I saw this in the most graphic terms when I returned to the Biden administration in 2021. I was shocked by what I saw. I had only been gone for 8 years, but it was as if the executive branch had been given steroids for the entire 8 years. One muscle was wildly over-strengthened. I talked to generals and intelligence officials who told me that their budget grew never less than 20% in any given year in their entire adult lifetime, which, as you know, gives no incentive to economize. The current director of the CIA, Bill Burns, a great diplomat, said, there are more members of military marching bands in the United States than the entire diplomatic corps. Now, the fact of the matter is that some branches, like some presidents like George W. Bush after 9/11 or Trump, seize the power proactively. Obama and Biden come in and say we're going to pull it back, but then they have such tiny legislative majorities, if any, that they end up using unilateral power in a crisis. So whatever happens, the pendulum keeps moving in one direction. Well, what about Congress? As you see it every day, it's almost a joke if it weren't such a tragedy. Congress is polarized, it's politicized, it's obstructionist. It does not legislate anymore. But more fundamentally, our public has come to accept Congress will do nothing. They don't blame Congress anymore for doing nothing. They don't expect them to do anything. What Congress can do is block treaties, so the United States doesn't enter any treaties anymore, and it can block confirmations. And just think what this means. In my position, the legal advisor's position, a new legal advisor was confirmed last week. I left the government in 2021. They got the legal advisor confirmed in 2024, 3 months before the end of the administration. Since 2013, 11 years, there's been a confirmed legal advisor of the State Department for 4 years. So for 7 years, there was no political appointee giving legal advice to the US government. Now, if unconfirmed officials are operating, they have no incentive to have any sort of fidelity to Congress, which is simply making its life miserable. And what about the courts? Well, they either use doctrines of justiciability to duck rulings, which means the president's decision stands, or increasingly they have stretched to uphold the action under two broad theories, and I'm happy to talk about them in Q&A. One is that even though the president's power is at its lowest ebb under Youngstown, the president still has enough power to overwhelm what Congress has done. A second is that the Curtis Wright case also said you should give statutes a generous reading when foreign affairs is at stake. And so the president takes vaguely appropriate statutes that have been found for him by his lawyers and reads into them reservoirs of power. In the few cases where the courts do push back, the executive branch just works around them. When I was in the government, someone said to me, we think of a Supreme Court ruling as like putting a rock in the water, because the water flows downstream and it's in the same place it would be anyway. So it doesn't really matter what they rule, we will work around it. Now, the gravity of the situation became desperately apparent during Donald Trump's presidency, because we had a president, up until Trump, we at least had presidents who claimed to care about the rule of law, or at least claimed to understand a constitution of checks and balances. He said, quote, I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president. That's his view. The Congress was subservient, and he showed, in a way that people had not fully understood, that he could appoint a majority of the court that's ready to defer to him. And you know many of the events, the Muslim ban, terminating agreements, trade unilateralism. You know, Donald Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum by calling Canada a national security threat. And then when Justin Trudeau called them, he said, well, you are the guys who burned the White House in the War of 1812. Which is his command of history and his respect for Canada. And that was when he was sharper than he is now. Or how about this? He says, I'm going to build a wall to keep immigrants out, and Mexico's going to pay for it. Of course, they didn't pay for it. Congress doesn't appropriate the money, and he declares Congress's refusal to appropriate to be an emergency. And it was not struck down. He killed Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Quds Force, politicized DOJ, and diverted foreign policy to partisan ends and commercial ends. And of course reached its zenith with 2 impeachments, both of which involved direct threats to national elections. One, his attempted quid pro quo with President Zelensky of Ukraine. 2, I need you to do me a favor though, give me opposition research on Hunter Biden if you want foreign aid like Javelin missiles. And then of course, refusing to accept the election results, encouraging January 6th. And as you've recently seen in the recent presidential and vice presidential debates, still refusing to acknowledge that he was ignoring the results of election and refusing to say whether he would step down. In fact, in the vice presidential debate on October 1st, just barely mentioned, was that J.D. Vance, a student at Yale Law School, said, I would look to the future, not say whether I'm going to, as vice president, certify if Kamala Harris is elected. And Waltz, the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, said, that's why Mike Pence is not here. I mean, they tried to kill him. And he then refused to certify Trump, and so he's gone. So the reason that you're here is so that you will do what Mike Pence wouldn't do. Are you going to commit now? And of course, Vance didn't give an answer. Why is this special? Because Trump invoked a legal theory. We're here in the law school. He said all of his actions were not just right, they were constitutional. Under this theory, any restraints coming from inside the government violate the theory of the unitary executive. Any constraints coming from outside are unconstitutional invasions of the president's power, which means we now have a theory of constitutional law that allows the president to nullify the rule of law for his own administration. And you've seen It operates effectively even after the president leaves office. You can use it to frustrate congressional oversight. You can see it by pardoning people who've committed crimes. After leaving office, you can take classified information to your own bathroom and not give it back. And then to win the most sweeping immunity ruling in history, and using that ruling to prevent further criminal proceedings so that there is no concluded case against Trump before the election. On this, he has succeeded. Now, in this, his willing accomplice has been six of the justices of the Supreme Court, who created a theory of immunity, which out of whole cloth. I clerked for Justice Blackmun in 1982, the last great immunity decision. I think it's fair to say not a single person in the Supreme Court, from the highest to the low, thought a former president could get the kind of immunity that they gave him. And just to give a sense of what it means, they said, John Roberts says in his opinion, the president talking to the attorney general is immune. Well, there was something called Watergate, which was the president talking to the attorney general and telling him, send people to burgle the Democratic National Committee. That information is proof of the impeachable offense, and now it's immunized. And while the Supreme Court is obsessed, and it comes through in Roberts' opinion over and over again, with enfeebling future presidents, the majority then just conveniently ignores the lawless president we just had and might have again in a couple of months. Now, what about the Democrats? In this saga, they are as much victims as villains, because all of the problems of the 21st century come down on the president: the economy, immigration, pandemics, climate change, AI, China, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Hamas. And consider this: Trump is not the worst president we could have. I know that's hard to imagine, but he does not invade a lot of countries. He's not competent. And, he has people who are constraining him. Imagine Trump 2.0, or call him J.D. Vance. There will be smarter, more clever versions. Call it Project 2025. And this is not solved by Kamala Harris being elected president, because I guess 4 years maybe, but we're just one election away from a disaster. So we have a situation where the president is always responsible, rarely accountable, in a second term, can't be checked by the Congress, the courts, or the ballot box. If Trump is elected, it will be his second term. We have no confidence that he will leave office, though, at the end. And if there was one thing clear in the original constitutional understanding, it was the president shouldn't be king, and that we should have a government of men and of laws and not men. But we now have a system that depends too much on the president's character when we have presidential candidates who have no character. Okay, that's the first 9 chapters of the book. What to do about it? I suggest a series of institutional reform, a strategy, and specifics. The strategy is to have a strong president within a strong system of checks and balances, and to do a series of reforms, mosaic of reforms, over many years if necessary, within the executive branch, to encourage balanced participation in Congress, to develop a set of institutional reforms. I'll say more about these in Q&A. And in the courts, to reduce barriers to judicial oversight, while empowering other institutional counterweights to check presidential power. And in the book, there are a whole series of recommendations that I run through in some detail: strengthening law enforcement independence in the Justice Department, improving the special counsel, regulating the pardon power, recognizing conflicts of interest as a national security threat. Just think about this. If you are the Saudis and Trump is elected president, why would you ever go to the US Embassy in Riyadh and talk to the ambassador if you want something? If you're Mohammed bin Salman, You send your guy to the Trump Hotel, they sit in the bar and they meet with Rudy Giuliani or Jared Kushner, and you make a deal which enriches somebody, and it's completely beyond governmental oversight. And I suggest a variety of ways to restrain the use of force: the Insurrection Act, the assassination ban, first use of nuclear weapons and other kinds of cyber and AI weapons. For Congress, I have three main recommendations. One is Congress was disaggregated, and as a result, the committee structure has been extremely weakened and there's very little legislation. In some areas, for example, tax, the US government has the Joint Committee on Taxation in the Congress, where an expert group of maybe 25 members of Congress suggests changes in tax policy with expert advice, which is deferred to by everyone. In foreign policy, though, it's a free-for-all. Why should Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz be holding Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, hostage over Ukraine aid? What is the system in which they're allowed to have this kind of influence as backbenchers? Secondly, there should be a congressional legal advisor, because all the opinions are saying the president can do it. Why doesn't Congress coordinate its legal advice to challenge that? So even if it's not justiciable in a court, we could have adversarial debate over these subjects. And third, we need better tools to replace the tools that have been declared unconstitutional, like the legislative veto. So for example, Kamala Harris should, if elected president, ask Congress for a 2-year authorization to use force on a limited basis against various kinds of threats in the Middle East, and have that be voted through on a fast track. And then that allows her to rely on congressional approval, even if it goes south. And it would be subject to renewal and sunsetting. She may want to do it alone at the beginning, but if it becomes unpopular and American soldiers die, or our allies get uncomfortable, see Afghanistan, we'd have she's on her own. Finally, the courts. The courts obviously have, in some ways, Roberts' court has been more willing to review cases on the merits. But compare this. In the census case, the Chief Justice required agencies offer genuine justifications for important decisions, but they don't apply that to foreign affairs. And in the travel ban case, the Muslim ban case, Justice Sotomayor said, this creates national security masquerades. Trump was allowed to say everything was national security, even when it wasn't. Over time, the courts could start to revise a bunch of doctrines they've developed that are explicitly anti-globalist. For example, the Supreme Court of Canada regularly looks to foreign precedents to decide how to interpret your own public law provisions. The United States used to do this, and now we have an absurd situation where the Democrat and Republican justices alike have to swear we will not look to foreign law. Brett Kavanaugh down at the bottom, my student, so I'm not such a good teacher, at his confirmation said, I believe in the American rule of law. Well, Brett, Canada has a rule of law too, It's not American property. And here's the irony. 12 of the justices have cited foreign law when it serves their purpose, even after making this mantra. In fact, 3 of the justices in the Roe versus Wade overruling case, Dobbs, cited foreign decisions to cite their presidents, to support their actions. So they'll do it. They just will say it's illegitimate to do it unless they do it. And it's ironic, obviously, because this claims to be an originalist court. America's first judges were internationalists. John Marshall didn't cite many cases under US law because there wasn't any US law. He cited international cases. And so the original jurisprudence of the US Supreme Court in constitutional law was largely foreign law. If you're an originalist, like Brett Kavanaugh, you must be an originalist, internationalist. If you're a nationalist, you're not really an originalist. So he can't have it both ways. And here's what I think is the most important point. You know, Americans, we are borrowers. I have not been to a bar mitzvah in the last 5 years where they didn't dance to Gangnam Style, which, by the way, has more than a billion hits. I think about 500 million from my own family. Who said you can borrow Korean music for a Jewish bar mitzvah? We only look to Jewish music at a bar mitzvah. You know, if I go to get a taco and they say, you want some kimchi? I say, yeah, put kimchi in my taco. Who said you can put Korean food in a Mexican dish? Well, guess what? Americans borrow, and in law we borrow. And borrowing is as American as der Frankfurter or Apfelkuchen, apple pie. The idea of these justices that we don't look outside to the very relevant decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada, including, for example, the Nevson case, which we'll be discussing tomorrow, is a very important cautionary lesson. And then finally, I suggest ways in which states and localities, the media, particularly Canada, which I consider to be really just a very powerful values partner, and private actors can combat or check. The last book I wrote before this one, The Trump Administration and International Law, described how these counterweights help slow Trump's efforts to disengage from the international system. So I'm almost done here. If you want more concrete and specific recommendations, I make particular recommendations on war powers, treaty making and breaking, sanctions, intelligence oversight, information control, and electoral security. Now, some people have said, oh, gee, Koh has changed his view. I don't think I have. Every time I see that, I look and they never get it right. But my boss, Justice Blackmun, said to me once, you know, life is long and you learn things. Do you seriously mean to say that a footnote I wrote in an article when I was 28 is something I should adhere to 30 years later when I'm working on an opinion for the US government at which thousands of lives are at stake? And I would say, trust me now, because now it counts. Other people say, look, we could hamstring the president. In fact, the current Supreme Court is obsessed with enfeebling the presidency. The real danger is the opposite. The president will become too powerful. And what I've learned from my time in the government, 4 times in 5 decades, executive power will find a way. I'm not worried about that. The greater danger by far is that we undercorrect, not overcorrect. Because if Kamala Harris is elected, nothing will happen on this front, believe me. For the first year, they have to, quote, look to the future. So why did I write this book at this stage of my career? Because the students like you, when you are being asked to go off and serve in the Middle East in a war that you didn't ask for, say, how did it get to be this way? And why didn't anybody in academia do anything or write anything about it? And I thought maybe somebody would say, well, there was this guy who was in the government for 10 years of his career, and he's a full-time academic. That might not happen again anytime soon. And he wrote this book, and there are ideas there, a lot of them, to be mined over the next 75 years, because the book is called The National Security Council and the Constitution in the 21st Century. We still have 75 years left. Isn't it the job of academics to leave behind ideas that will help create a better tomorrow? So in closing, America, we have a problem. It's structural, it's not just personalities. If we throw the rascals out, you can be sure there will be new rascals. So this is a structural problem that requires a structural solution. And let me close with the famous joke. How many shrinks does it take to change a light bulb? The light bulb must want to change. Well, same thing here. If you accept my diagnosis, the alternatives are acceptance, despair, or reform. And if we can't reform now, we should reform later. Now, a lot of people say, look, the current political situation is so dysfunctional, we'll never get there. Well, it's not going to be forever, I don't think. Both Kamala Harris and Keir Starmer have said, let's put country first. And maybe the answer is to not talk about America first, but being Americans first. Americans must want to change and reconceptualize how their governmental institutions will operate in the 21st century. But rest assured, if we cannot change, we will be stuck with the national security constitution and the national security threats that we deserve, which is why I wrote this book and why I came to give this lecture. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you for inviting me here today.
Thank you very much, Professor Koh. We open up the floor for questions now. If you would like to ask a question in the room, if you could go to one of our microphones on the side.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. My question is that in the Trump 2024 case, it seemed that both arguments seem to focus on different cases on which constitutional theory to adopt. And I guess my question is, how much does U.S. constitutional history matter to interpreting the U.S. Constitution? Because at least in Canada, constitutional history plays a big part in how we interpret our Constitution. And the U.S. created their Constitution in response to British tyranny and British control. And it seems that the theory that the Supreme Court adopted seems to be contradictory to every single reason why the American Constitution was found in the first place, and how it emerged after the American Revolution. So I guess, how does U.S. constitutional history play a role here?
Well, thank you. Good question, and I'm glad you asked it. And that explains the first 9 chapters of the book. You know, it's too easy to say, hey, look, it's always been this way. It hasn't. And the reason to go through 9 eras of American history is to show that this tension between balanced institutional power and unilateralism was present at the start. And there were moments where unilateralism surged, and then something happened that pushed it back. That happened repeatedly, over and over, through American history. It was only in the 21st century, and particularly after 9/11, 24 years ago, that the unilateralism trend started to become the dominant trend. Now, it hasn't been formally embraced by the Supreme Court, or Congress for that matter, although the immunity decision shows how much 6 justices have bought into these ideas. So the reason I go through this long 250 pages before we start to talk about what to do about it is to give the evidence that the balanced shared power view kept reasserting itself as the default theory, and that only recently have people started to adopt this. Now, everybody in the 21st century has a very short time span, and they're all asserting these extremely broad views of presidential power. But the answer is, look back at this history. That's not what was intended originally. That's not what was intended now. That's not what our allies do. For example, let me start with the example of whether you could withdraw from a treaty without congressional approval. Well, look at the UK Supreme Court. They ruled that the British government had to consult with and get a vote from Parliament before they did Brexit. Why don't we look at that precedent? The South African courts said that South Africa couldn't withdraw from the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court without congressional or parliamentary approval. Why? Because these things affect too many people in the country. And so, and I do an analysis of Canadian law as well, it's precisely because these precedents are so often misstated by people who are expressing these, their particular view. You know, don't look to foreign precedent. Well, guess what? 12 justices do so, including the ones who are most vocal about not doing it when it serves their purpose. So, you know, let's tell the truth about what's going on. And the truth requires going back to history. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Dania. I'm Iraqi, so unfortunately, American national security and the mess of it is not foreign to me. I was wondering what, in your opinion, the role is of like lobbying efforts, and like certain politicians will be motivated to, as you have said, like have less restrictions on presidents being able to go into foreign wars and things like that. So I was wondering what you thought of the role of, like whether it's lobbying or campaign finance reform and things like that are in trying to bring back these checks and balances in foreign affairs.
Well, unfortunately, most of these checks have been eliminated. When the Supreme Court started to equate money and speech, which they started to do in 1976 in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo, a prominent constitutional law professor, Paul Freund, says, we all know money talks, but that's the problem. That's not the answer. Citizens United allows massive, uncontrolled and unregulated spending and brought an end to the public financing of campaigns. So even Obama, who professed that he could run based on Federal Election Campaign Commission guidelines, abandoned it because he simply couldn't raise enough money. And so the US political system has turned into a big money game. And as many have chronicled, it's dark money. So that huge amounts of money are being funneled in. Trump gets regular tranches of money. And understandably, those are the interests he's interested to serve with his tax cuts and other things that he's proposing. So I completely agree with you that these other checks have been cut back, but there are other kinds of restraints. I'll tell you this amazing story. I'm asked to go into the Biden administration right after the inauguration, after this period of horror among many rule of law advocates about what Trump had done. And I'm driving to Washington for my first day of work. And I get a text from one of my former students who's in the government, a career lawyer. And he says, we have a group that meets on Zoom on Monday nights. It was Monday night. He said, would you be willing to talk to us? And I said, well, I'm going to be on the New Jersey Turnpike, but I'll pull off at a McDonald's. And I'm there tapping into their Wi-Fi and looking on my iPad at the Zoom. 300 screens come in. Career lawyers from all over the US government. And I said, wow, who are you guys? And they said, we call ourselves Deep State. And I said, what do you do? He said, we resist illegal action from inside the government. And I said, give me some examples of what you do. So they gave some remarkable examples. One of the things is, they said, Trump never gives a direct order. I mean, you can understand this. Mob bosses don't give a direct order either. He'll say things like, wouldn't it be nice to shoot demonstrators in the legs? But he doesn't say, shoot them in the legs. Or he'll say, let's terminate this agreement. Wouldn't it be, that agreement should be terminated. But he doesn't tell someone to terminate the agreement. So over and over, parts of the US bureaucracy did not do what he said because these commands were illegal in their view. And by the way, if you work in the US government or any government, you take an oath to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States of America, not to serve whoever happens to be president at the time. Now, The solution now being proposed, so-called Schedule F, is to just purge the government of all these people. And that's one of the plans. You know, the Trump administration learned its lessons about deep state from round one. That's what makes the second term much scarier, both because of what they've learned and because there is no check and balance. There's another story I heard that just absolutely chilled me, which was a journalist who works for the White House, works at the White House, and in Congress, he covers both, said that he was in the Capitol on January 6th. And you know, they have the riots and all the demonstrations and everything. And then finally, the Congress regathered and voted through Biden's election. And it's 2 o'clock in the morning. And he decides, I'm going to go down to that elevator where Mitch McConnell, former minority leader, usually comes down. And he gets on the elevator, and there is McConnell coming down. And he says, well, Senator, what do you think about what just happened today? And McConnell said, he's through, he's done, he's finished, he'll never come back, meaning Trump. Turned out McConnell can't stand Trump. And he said, what do you mean he's done? And he said, well, you know, we just voted Biden in. That's the end of him. Well, what happened next? You know, they had a motion to impeach Trump. It had been voted out of the House, and it was going to the Senate. McConnell pushed that vote till after Biden took office. 10 Republican senators voted for it. McConnell went against it. They didn't get 2/3 to convict Trump. Trump was not impeached or removed from office after the fact. And the other aspect of that is he would have been disqualified from being president again. McConnell was entirely responsible for that. And then when he stepped down as minority leader, he said, I support Trump. I mean, this is, you know, cowardice and incompetence at a first-class level. And, you know, among many other things that he did. But I think it's worth knowing is that the way in which one party accepted an assault on the rule of law, with certain exceptions, you know, Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney. Who thought Dick Cheney would be an American hero? You know, Mitt Romney. Not a single one of the presidential candidates of recent years support the current Republican candidate. That's why he had to go and get J.D. Vance, who was, you know, obviously just a chameleon based on his own life story. So another thing, and too, just very relevant to your situation, the Iraq War was a good example of just the executive branch just going to Congress and just lying about facts. There are weapons of mass destruction. There weren't weapons of mass destruction. The vote that they got from Congress, and this is one of the few times they went to Congress, was based on a factual misstatement. And nevertheless, you're there. And we saw what has happened since. So it was a catastrophic failure. But, you know, George W. Bush is one of the rule of law people now compared to the people we have now. So it's not just the pendulum has been moving, the elevator has been descending. And every time you think it's hit the bottom, it just keeps going. Now, I personally have enough optimism to believe that there will be a turnaround. And I think some of that turnaround will come from younger people who just think, look at the trouble that we got into. I mean, anyone who is in the United States remembers what chaos occurred during the pandemic when we had a president who said, why don't you drink bleach, right? So, you know, fortunately, these memories are strong enough. Ironically, one of the things that's happening in the campaign is that young people who weren't going to vote for Biden are now saying they will vote. But the question is, why weren't they ready to vote for Biden? You know, you have a candidate who doesn't believe in the rule of law and the one who does, and they wouldn't come out to vote. It's your future. This is what happened in Brexit. The younger people didn't vote. And as a result, those who wanted to leave, I was just in the UK not a single person I spoke to thought that Brexit had been a good thing. The economy has declined by 15%. All of these things have recurred. It was a good example about lies and referendum and other kinds of things misleading the public and leading to catastrophic organic transformational change. So let's hope we can avoid that. Yes.
Hello, my name is Kamita, and recently Bob Woodward had released a new book that had alleged that former President Trump had at least 7 conversations with Russian President Vladimir Putin after he left office. And it's brought up questions whether or not the former president can be tried under the Logan Act for going against the US administration. Do you think that is a possibility, and what would that mean for his candidacy as the next US president?
Well, it's a possibility, but he's under 91 counts of indictment already. The Logan Act is one of the weaker claims. I don't think anybody's been successfully prosecuted under the Logan Act. It's in my book, actually, ever. The issue with Putin, though, is a very serious one, because, as you recall, Trump met with Putin and no one took notes. Now, if you're in the diplomatic corps and you meet with a high presidential leader, somebody should be there. He met with Putin for 2.5 hours. This is not Bob Woodward. This is an official accounting, and nobody was there. What do you think he said? Well, the best guess is he said, I think that we should get Crimea. I think we should get the Donbass. I think we should take Ukraine. And Trump, who knows very little but thinks he knows a lot, said, I don't like the Ukrainians either. At which Putin took as a signal. By the way, why do you think Putin invaded Ukraine? The United States had just elected Donald Trump president. Boris Johnson is the prime minister of the UK. He thought NATO was not going to respond. His view was, this is my chance. And so it wasn't a miscalculation at the time if you were in Putin's shoes. And now what Woodward says strikes me as completely consistent with what we've seen, that Trump admires Putin. And I think Putin considers Trump to be a useful idiot. Or let me just give you another example, because it's very close to my heart. North Korea. My family's from Korea. I went with Madeleine Albright to North Korea for 5 days in 2000. And we met with Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un. As we were leaving, we thought there was a possibility of some kind of conversations with the North Koreans that could lead to an eventual normalization of relations over a period of 20 years. But we all said, the president of the United States can never meet with the president of North Korea, unless the president of North Korea has made zillions of concessions. Like what? Stop building nuclear weapons. Like, I will accept food aid. Like, we will shut down the Yongbyon nuclear power plant. Like, I will release hundreds of political prisoners. The President of the United States is not supposed to meet with 194th power. And there, Donald Trump meets Kim Jong-un and got played by him. And to this day, he thinks it was a success. And in fact, it's the documents from those meetings that he's holding in Mar-a-Lago and classifying, because he's so proud of what was essentially a humiliating diplomatic failure. And to this day, many of his supporters don't understand what a disastrous outcome this was. Kim Jong-un is one of the worst human rights violators in the world. When I went to North Korea, I was getting an intelligence briefing, and they showed me a map of North Korea, and there were all of these blacked out areas. And I said, what are those blacked out areas? And they said, labor camps, prison labor camps. And I said, that one's very close to Pyongyang, the capital. how big is it? And the guy said, Mr. Secretary, that's the size of the District of Columbia. He said, we guess that there are 3 or 4 million people there working on forced labor, slave labor, being fed nothing. That's the guy that the President of the United States met with. Now, what you see here, and this is a more important point, is are we going to live in a world of 1984 where the powerful deal with the powerful, make up the truth, change their alliances day to day? Or are we going to live in a kind of world as described by Immanuel Kant, where law-abiding democracies cooperate around common values? Because that's where Canada, Australia, the NATO nations can all have a huge impact on a collective alliance action to resist someone like Putin. So I'm not surprised by anything Woodward says. I don't know if it's true or not. My guess is Woodward has very good sources. Nobody's ever, to my mind, proven that he got something wrong, partly because he's dealing with some of the people who are closest in. What's shocking is that this kind of information, as revealed, doesn't seem to have much of an impact on anybody.
Hi there. Thank you for talking to us here today, Professor. My question relates to the point you brought up where you said that the American public really has to want to bring about this change. And like, for example, you said that the American public kind of just accepts that Congress doesn't really even legislate now, doesn't really do anything. And so I was wondering if you had any comments on if anyone has a responsibility to help promote that change in the American public, like whether that's a role for like the media, academia, or the government itself.
Everybody does, but particularly educators. I mean, by the way, every university in America teaches introductory economics. Are tariffs good for the economy? I'm sorry, tariffs get passed on to the consumers. If you impose a tariff on a foreign product, the price the consumer pays will rise. If you take it off, it will fall. If someone at a debate says, my solution is to impose more tariffs, and it's not going to affect inflation, somebody who took economics has to say, that's just obviously wrong. And that's where I think, there was an incredible moment in the vice presidential debate where J.D. Vance is repeating stories about Haitians eating dogs and other kinds of things, at which point the moderator said, well, that's not true. And he said, I thought we had an agreement that I'm not going to be fact-checked, right? But at the end of the day, if the average voter who's listening doesn't understand the way of the world well enough to understand that what they're hearing is a disastrous statement, disastrously wrong, as opposed to something that they're trying to sell, that's a problem. So a lot of it is a problem of education at the most basic level, I think. And most of the things are things that the average college sophomore knows. Yes.
Hi, I'm Ethan. Thank you for your talk. I have a question about the recent decision which grants broad immunity to the president for official acts as president. And you used Nixon talking to his attorney general as an example. Do you mind explaining more about how I think we both agree that that was not an official act. How would the recent decision affect national security in a more broad sense?
Well, I don't have to speculate about that because Jack Smith, the prosecutor, just issued to Judge Chutkan a revised version of the indictment where things are characterized as private acts, acts of a presidential candidate, not as acts of a president. Now, Judge Chutkan has already released this, and there are a bunch of things that were in the new indictment, the revised indictment, that nobody knew. For example, that they went up and told Trump they're going to kill Pence on January 6th, or they're calling him for him to be killed, and he said, so what? If you're J.D. Vance running for vice president, doesn't that concern you? Or how about this on immunity? The position that the lawyer took is that the sitting president could authorize SEAL Team 6 to shoot his political opponent and be immune? Well, Joe Biden is the sitting president. Trump is the former president. That decision, if read that way, would allow Biden to order SEAL Team 6 to kill Trump. It's not a victory for Trump. So I think, as often happens, though, and this is my real answer to your question, the Supreme Court issues extremely broad guidelines that turn out to be implausible or unacceptable, and then the lower courts carve it back into its core. Judge Chutkan is a very good judge, and I don't think she believes a word of this, and I think she thinks that most of the counts of the indictment under the January 6th case can be deemed to be private acts, and she will so designate, and then it will come back up later on down the line. Yes?
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking presentation. The context of my question takes place in my own research. I'm a doctoral student here at Osgood. I would like to know how, if at all, technology factors into your understanding of this legislative and judicial shift towards a president-centric justification for constitutional overreach. And does this shift offer an easier national security justification, particularly in the context of emerging technologies such as quantum and quantum-enabled artificial intelligence? Thank you.
Well, when 34 of the world's leaders on artificial intelligence say this is one of the most dangerous things we've ever seen, you have to take that very seriously. I've written about it, most recently the Yale Journal of International Law. The danger with artificial intelligence in wartime is lethal autonomous weapons systems, where a robot makes a decision to acquire and target a human being. You've all seen the Terminator movies. That's essentially what they're describing. Now, from a human rights perspective, and the Nathanson Center is a human rights perspective, what's so disturbing about this? It undoes Nuremberg. Before Nuremberg, if someone committed genocide, the people who ordered it would say, we didn't know they were going to do anything. And the street level people would say, I was just following orders, and they all got off. Nuremberg said, the trials, everyone is responsible. Command responsibility at the top, and you don't have a just following orders defense on the ground. But if you have a system where one person programs, one person does the algorithm, another person does the hardware, another person is doing the remote command, another person is the person on the ground, they will all say, like Shaggy, it wasn't me, right? And no one's responsible. And what we really do need, and this is where the Canadians led the way on in Ottawa on the Landmines Convention, a clear rule, no dumb mines. Well, we should have no lethal autonomous weapons systems in which killing decisions can be made without human oversight at the last clear chance to kill somebody. Why? We're already seeing it. The two big conflicts we have going on right now, Ukraine-Russia and Israel-Hamas, massive use of automated weapons. And the world we're entering is one where cyber-assisted AI will fight cyber-assisted AI with the kinetic work being done by mercenaries like the Wagner Group. And if that's the case, who's going to suffer? Civilians. And by the way, we're talking about playing God here. And playing God is already happening in AI. For example, Tesla engineers value the lives of people inside Teslas more than the lives of people outside Teslas. Why? Because if they didn't do that, nobody would buy a Tesla. So in California, in San Francisco, where my son lives, they have a thing called Waymo. These cars have no drivers. But if there's a crash, they're supposed to hit somebody rather than hurt the person in the car. That means they're trading lives. They're making decisions about whose life matters more. And then when you put in facial recognition software, that's an invitation for racial profiling and all other kinds of things. So a key part of this is for algorithms to be made accountable. And that has to be a critical part of how war is going to be constrained going forward. And increasingly, the laws that the US has on this, the War Powers Resolution, they all involve human beings crossing borders and entering into foreign airspace, and then staying for more than a certain number of days. But if the way that war is going to be conducted is through cyber commands, drones, unmanned water vehicles, none of these laws apply. They're being made obsolete by the day. So this is a central challenge. And here we have a number of aging politicians who do not understand the impact of this technology. Now, don't get me wrong. Having humans in the loop doesn't guarantee that war is humane. It's hard to imagine a more inhumane war than the war in Ukraine, which has been run by Vladimir Putin. But at least Vladimir Putin can be held accountable for his choices. And my view is that that's something that will happen and play out over the rest of our lifetimes. Yes?
Thank you, Professor, for your insightful presentation. Here is my question. Looking beyond the U.S. domestic side, if the U.S. president pushes island leaders to take actions that disrupt global order, like using sanctions to isolate certain countries, could that be seen as irresponsible state behavior or even a violation of international law? If yes, can international law do anything to limit the president's unilateral actions? And if not, beyond the returning to domestic checks and balances, how could international law be improved to help control such behavior? Thank you.
So clearly the alternative to kinetic warfare is economic warfare, which means sanctions. And the two kinds of legal constraints on sanctions are at an international level, particularly rules of the WTO. And the WTO, and particularly its dispute settlement bodies, are in a state of limbo and confusion because of the failure to revitalize the dispute settlement body. At the domestic level, sanctions that the US imposes are legislation that was passed by Congress that has never gone off the books. The United States currently has something like 42 emergency sanctions programs against countries that have existed going back to 1959. These emergencies are never lifted. And so that gives the president extraordinary power under these congressional blank checks to impose sanctions. Now, that's one of the things that I suggest should, Congress has a habit of passing a law, saying they did, and then blaming it on the president. And that's the president's curse. But some of these things have to be brought more back into shape. And this is where Biden, frankly, has used the sanctions power at an extraordinary level because Ukraine's not a part of NATO and he hasn't come in for this purpose. The other way to do it is to sell arms. And that's also happened at an unprecedented level. I do think that this is increasingly the subject of concern. The real problem, it's hard to get the world to focus on misuse of sanctions when you have also massive misuse of military power through aggression and other kinds of humanitarian violations, which is occurring on a massive scale, both in the Middle East and in Ukraine. Yes.
First and foremost, I must say good afternoon. I came a little bit late, but I came on time. But ultimately, Professor Koh, thank you so very much for coming, and welcome to your university, Osgood Law School. Here's my question.
Thank you.
In the context of the reality of a multipolar world order, could you offer insights on how a national security reform movement will consider greater alignment with international law as it relates to the U.S. foreign policy process?
Okay, look, simply put, the alternative to war is diplomacy.
Absolutely.
And the way that you do diplomacy is through alliances. And in many respects, the president's unilateralism at home has been compensated for by alliance politics. In other words, that other countries, particularly in the NATO meetings and the G7 and G20 meetings, have exercised restraint. And this is where Canada has played an extremely important role in checking, because Canada wants to be a law-abiding country. And no country is perfect, but that's the important role that they've played. Now, Trump has no interest in diplomacy. That's the problem. If you were to summarize the problem with Trump's whole approach, it is transactional. He has a very crude notion of deals, making deals, and winning deals. Well, as we all know in life, life is not about transactions, it's about relationships. And if you're going to have these relationships, that's what you need to sustain alliances. And to sustain alliances, you need an ability to make international agreements that hold and stick, and then harden them and thicken them into international institutions. So by the way, Trump withdrew from all these institutions like the Paris Climate Agreement, the World Health Organization. Think about this. He withdrew from the World Health Organization during the worst global pandemic in history. That's insane. And by the way, he still thinks that was a good idea. Now, what it really means now is, A, those alliances need to prove their worth. B, those alliances need to express their voice against abuse of executive power. And third, those alliances have to be bolstered by strengthening the international institutions that they're a part of. So it's true, NATO, many of the countries didn't pay their 2%, and I know that's been a big debate here in Canada. But at this point, if NATO is going to continue to check Putin, I mean, what is shocking about the debate that Trump had was to ask him, okay, you can solve Ukraine on the first day of your presidency. How? I can solve it in one day. How would you do it? Tell Putin, go ahead. That's essentially what he's saying. Then the question is, what happens next? We're talking Moldova, we're talking Lithuania, we're talking Transnistria, we're talking Poland. And by the way, Harris did say that. Are you going to tell all the Polish Americans who live here that their country is next because you've abandoned these alliances? So, at the end of the day, those of us who believe in law must believe in continued diplomacy as the solution, which means, by the way, that our legal rules can't make it easy to go to war and use force with robots and make it very hard to make deals or make diplomatic relationships sustained. Trump called the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris climate deal the worst deals in history. I don't think he's read either one, and he has absolutely no substitute for it. If you ask him, if you didn't have them, what would you do? He doesn't have a solution. In Iran, the solution was let Iran build a nuclear weapon, and they're now pretty much there. That's his solution. But it's true domestically. You want to get rid of healthcare, what are you going to have instead? Well, I have concepts of a plan, So, again, you can't take, you'd have to make this up. It's really kind of amazing to watch. But again, it's the absence of a strategy for global affairs which acknowledges that the US can't engage the world without its closest allies who share its values working with it within a framework of diplomacy and international law.
Thank you so very much. Diplomacy is the best policy. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Yes, sir.
Hello, and thank you again for the lecture. My question is about the recommendations your book makes around restraining the use of force. And if you could say a little bit more about that, because it seems to me often that despite constant prognostications about the life or death of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, often it's not only the unilateral action of a president that erodes the prohibition on the use of force, but oftentimes it has more to do with the slow erosion that comes through legal arguments that continuously carve out exceptions, like say with the Bethlehem Principles, to the otherwise prohibition on the use of force.
I disagree with what you just said about the Bethlehem Principles. There is a need to develop rules of self-defense that meet the modern age. You could not have rules of self-defense that require the response in the same way in the Caroline case, because, let me just give you this example. We have a rule that you can use force if they're about to attack a building with an airplane. They did that already. Or when they're going to put a bomb in a cartridge, they did that already. Or they're going to put a bomb in somebody's sneakers, they did that already. The delivery method will change. So the question is, at what point are you allowed to take action in genuine self-defense? And what the Bethlehem Principle calls for is elongating the immediacy requirement because of the change in circumstance. That, I think, is a reasonable adjustment to the conditions. Could they be misused? Yes. Can any legal rules be misused? Yes. But I think that the broader problem is self-defense becoming preemptive offense and existentialist strategies. I mean, nobody denies that Netanyahu or that the government of Israel had a right to respond to the gruesome and horrible attacks of October 7th. But at some point, there are restraints from jus in bello about what kind of force you can use and how indiscriminately that force can be used. Now, we have rules from international humanitarian law that say you can't use force disproportionately, which also suggests you can't use force indiscriminately. And it's very hard to explain some of these targeting decisions that have been made in Gaza that are primarily directed against civilian targets, even if the explanation is that a Hamas guy is in a tunnel underneath. Are we really going to allow people to bomb a hospital and everybody in it because there might be a Hamas guy in the tunnel below? What Aaron Barak, the great president of the Israeli Supreme Court, said is democracies have to fight wars with their one hand behind their back. Now, I think the problem that we have with the UN is just that the Security Council is a broken mechanism and should be reformed. I was talking to Bob Ray, your great diplomat who's ambassador to the UN, and he said one of the advantages of the dysfunction of the Security Council, especially when you have a continuous Russian veto, is that more activity shifts into the General Assembly, and Canada's in the General Assembly. It didn't get elected to the Security Council. So Canada has more of a voice because of the way things have played out. But I think the real thing everybody should be worrying about is that if resort to force without threatening your own soldiers becomes so easy, then it's much easier to use a SEAL team to try to, quote, solve a problem than a long-term diplomatic solution. But one thing I learned from in the government, if you kill the number 3 guy in a terrorist organization, the next day, somebody else is the number 3 guy. You don't destroy these organizations. And that suggests that military solutions, did somebody tell Netanyahu, if you have an only military approach to this problem, you cannot succeed. That seems to be obvious. You have to have a diplomatic aspect of this, which involves some kind of notion of ceasefire and some kind of notion of a peace treaty at the end of the road that puts in place something that succeeds the Oslo Accords. But that's not something that he's willing to consider. So I think international law has to be directed toward sustaining durable, peaceful solutions. And you know, my view is that I think that some of the adjustments that were made to international law rules are defensible, and some of them are not.
So I think our time is up, so I'm going to conclude here. Professor Koh, thank you so much for an enlightening talk and for joining us here at Osgood. On behalf of the Nathanson Center, can you please join me in thanking Professor Koh.
Thank you.